The sound echoed through courtroom 7B like thunder. Charles Whitmore's booming laughter, rich and cruel, bouncing off mahogany walls where justice was supposed to reign. 58 years of unchallenged arrogance poured from his throat as he watched his wife of 30 years clutch a thin manila folder with trembling hands. "Your Honor." Evelyn's voice barely rose above a whisper. "I will represent myself." The collective gasp from the gallery was immediate. Even Judge Margaret Harrison's weathered face betrayed surprise. Charles doubled over, slapping his knee like he'd heard the world's finest joke. His $500 an hour attorney, David Sterling, smirked behind designer glasses. "This will be over in 20 minutes, Charles whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Little did the millionaire know, he was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his privileged life. Sometimes the mouse roars back. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Charles Whitmore hadn't always been a monster. 30 years ago, in a cramped college dorm room, he'd been a different man, softer, kinder, full of dreams instead of demands. He'd met Evelyn Grace Patterson in the campus library, where she sat surrounded by worn paperbacks, her honey-colored hair catching afternoon sunlight through tall windows. She was studying literature. He was struggling through engineering. She helped him with his writing assignments. He fixed her broken radio with gentle hands that still knew how to create instead of just conquer. Their love story began like so many others, young, hopeful, innocent. Evelyn had grown up in small-town Ohio, daughter of a factory worker who taught her that honest work was its own reward. Her mother had died when she was 16, leaving behind a collection of handwritten recipes and a belief that kindness could heal any wound. Charles came from rural Kentucky poverty, raised by a bitter father after his mother's death when he was 12. Perhaps that's why Evelyn's gentle nature had drawn him like a moth to flame. They married the summer after graduation, in a simple ceremony at her childhood church. Evelyn wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her smaller frame. Charles promised her the world in handwritten vows that made the congregation weep. They moved to California with 2 suitcases, a wedding gift of $500, and dreams bigger than their studio apartment. But dreams have a way of changing people. Charles's first startup failed spectacularly, draining their savings and Evelyn's college fund. She dropped out without complaint, taking night shifts at a diner while he rebuilt. His second venture collapsed when investors pulled out. Evelyn sold her mother's engagement ring, the only valuable thing she owned, to keep them afloat. By the time Whitmore Digital Solutions finally succeeded, Charles had forgotten the man who once fixed radios with gentle hands. Success hardened him like winter frost. Each million earned building higher walls around his heart. Evelyn remained the same kind, supportive, invisible. They'd tried for children, but their only pregnancy ended in tragedy at 7 months. They never spoke of the baby again. That silence growing into a chasm neither could cross. Now, at 58, Charles commanded a $50 million empire. At 55, Evelyn commanded nothing, or so everyone believed. Her early-stage Parkinson's diagnosis 6 months earlier had been the final excuse Charles needed to abandon ship before she became, in his words, damaged goods. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the marble floors of the Whitmore mansion as California's elite gathered to celebrate Charles's 58th birthday. The sprawling estate in Palo Alto hummed with the quiet conversations of tech moguls, venture capitalists, and politicians who'd grown fat on Silicon Valley's endless feast. Evelyn moved through the crowd like a ghost, refilling wine glasses and ensuring the catered appetizers never ran empty invisible labor that had defined her existence for 3 decades. She wore the navy dress Charles had bought her for such occasions, the one that made her look, in his words, appropriately understated. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the serving platters, the early symptoms of Parkinson's disease making simple tasks increasingly difficult. The diagnosis had come 6 months earlier, delivered by a kind neurologist who'd held her hand while explaining that her remaining years would be measured in quality, not quantity. Charles stood at the center of the main salon, regaling a circle of admirers with stories of his latest acquisition, a blockchain company that promised to revolutionize everything, though none of them could quite explain how. His laugh boomed across the room, the same laugh that would soon echo through that courtroom. At 28, Ashley Thompson hung on his arm like expensive jewelry, her marketing degree from USC making her seem profound to men who mistook youth for innovation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Charles announced, tapping his champagne flute with a silver spoon that had belonged to Evelyn's grandmother. The room fell silent, 200 faces turning toward him with the reverence reserved for those who controlled their economic destinies. "Tonight, I want to share something personal with you all." Evelyn froze near the kitchen entrance, a tray of empty glasses balanced in her shaking hands. Something in Charles's tone triumphant, cruel, made her stomach clench with dread. "After 30 years of marriage," Charles continued, his arm tightening around Ashley's waist, "Evelyn and I have decided to part ways. We're better as friends, and she'll be well taken care of, I assure you." He raised his glass toward Evelyn, who stood motionless in her navy dress, feeling 200 pairs of eyes dissecting her like specimens under a microscope. "I'm pleased to introduce you to my future wife, Ashley, who represents everything I hope for in this next chapter of my life." The applause was polite but uncomfortable. These people had known Evelyn for decades, had eaten at her table, had received her quiet kindness during their own difficult times. Yet none of them met her eyes as Charles painted her as an obstacle overcome. A chapter closed in his relentless march toward whatever he believed constituted happiness. Evelyn set the tray down carefully and walked through the French doors onto the back terrace, where the view of the San Francisco Bay spread out like scattered diamonds. The cool evening air carried the scent of jasmine from the garden she'd planted with her own hands, back when she still believed their marriage could grow into something beautiful. Harold Whitfield, Charles's business partner and oldest friend, followed her outside. His wife had divorced him years earlier, taking half his assets and all of his children's respect. "What will you do now, Evelyn?" he asked, his voice carrying what might have been genuine concern or morbid curiosity. Through the windows, she could see the party continuing without her, Charles holding court while Ashley gazed at him with the adoration of someone who'd never seen him break a promise, never watched him abandon everything he claimed to love when it became inconvenient. The guests whispered among themselves, already writing her obituary in Silicon Valley social circles. "I suppose," Evelyn said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "I'll finally speak for myself." The mahogany doors of Sterling, Blackwood & Associates gleamed like polished coffins in the morning San Francisco fog. David Sterling's reputation preceded him through the marble corridors, 30 years of divorce cases, 0 losses, a man who could dissect a marriage with surgical precision and leave the weaker party financially eviscerated. Charles had chosen him specifically for his cruelty disguised as legal expertise. "Mrs. Whitmore," Sterling had said during their initial consultation, his smile sharp as a scalpel, "your husband is offering $500,000. Given your limited contributions to the marriage, I'd advise accepting immediately. Fighting this would be professional suicide for any attorney foolish enough to represent you." The law firms of downtown San Francisco formed an exclusive club, and Charles Whitmore held lifetime membership. Morrison and Associates claimed conflict of interest. They'd represented Charles in 3 previous business acquisitions. Hartwell Legal cited insufficient grounds for successful litigation. The boutique firm of Chen and Partners was more direct. "Mrs. Whitmore, we simply cannot win against David Sterling with your case." Each rejection felt like a door slamming shut, until Evelyn found herself in the cramped office of Marcus Rivera, a young attorney fresh from law school who practiced out of a converted warehouse in Oakland. His desk was buried under case files, student loan notices scattered between coffee-stained legal briefs. "I'll be honest," Rivera said, adjusting wire-rimmed glasses held together with electrical tape. "I've never handled a high-asset divorce. Sterling will eat me alive, and you'll lose everything. My advice, take the settlement and disappear." That night, Evelyn sat in her empty house. Charles had moved into Ashley's downtown loft the day after the party, surrounded by 30 years of accumulated life. Photo albums chronicled their journey from struggling newlyweds to Silicon Valley royalty. but the images felt like archaeological artifacts from someone else's existence. In the later photos, she noticed, she appeared less and less, until she was merely a shadow in the background of Charles's increasingly public life. The Santa Clara County Law Library became her sanctuary, built in the 1960s. Its fluorescent lights hummed over rows of legal tomes that promised justice to those brave enough to understand their language. Margaret Chen, the head librarian, found Evelyn there every morning at 9, hunched over texts on contract law, corporate structure, and fiduciary responsibility. "You know," Margaret said one afternoon, setting a cup of tea beside Evelyn's growing stack of notes, "I've seen a lot of people try to represent themselves. Most fail because they're fighting emotion with law. You're different. You're building something." Evelyn looked up from California Family Code Section 2550, her eyes red from strain. "I'm trying to understand how 30 years of partnership can legally equal nothing." "Maybe the law isn't the only weapon you have," Margaret suggested gently. "Sometimes the truth is sharper than any legal precedent." For 3 months, Evelyn dissected her marriage with the thoroughness of a forensic accountant. She retrieved documents from storage units Charles had forgotten existed, boxes of old contracts, correspondence, financial records from their earliest years. In a dusty filing cabinet, she found something that made her hands shake, not from Parkinson's, but from recognition: the original business plan for Whitmore Digital Solutions, written in her careful handwriting. The plan detailed a revolutionary concept called Digital Bridge, designed to help small businesses navigate the emerging internet economy. Every page bore her signature, her ideas, her vision for a company that would democratize technology instead of hoarding it. She remembered writing it during those difficult years when Charles's confidence had crumbled along with his previous ventures, when she'd worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat while nurturing his broken dreams back to life. She found canceled checks proving her financial contributions, money from her diner shifts, her weekend catering jobs, her freelance bookkeeping that had funded their first prototype. Letters from early investors addressed to both Charles and Evelyn Whitmore, acknowledging her intellectual property rights. Audio recordings from business meetings where Charles clearly credited her with the company's foundational concepts. None of this would exist without Evelyn's vision. His voice crackled from an old cassette tape, recorded during a presentation to venture capitalists in 1995. "She sees connections where the rest of us see obstacles." The evidence painted a picture Sterling had never imagined: not a dependent housewife clinging to unearned wealth, but a founding partner systematically erased from her own company's history. Each document was a breadcrumb leading back to a truth Charles had spent decades burying under his own mythology. On the morning of the hearing, Evelyn arrived at the Santa Clara County Courthouse carrying a single manila folder and 30 years of suppressed truth. Her hands trembled as she walked through the metal detectors, past the gallery packed with Charles's business associates and curious onlookers drawn by media coverage of the Millionaire's divorce spectacle. Charles sat at the plaintiff's table in his $1,000 suit, flanked by Sterling and 2 associate attorneys. When he saw Evelyn enter alone, his laughter began that rich, cruel sound that would define the battle ahead. "Your Honor," Judge Margaret Harrison said as the proceedings began, her gray eyes taking in the disparity between the opposing sides. "This court recognizes Charles Whitmore as plaintiff, represented by Sterling, Blackwood and Associates, and Evelyn Whitmore as defendant, appearing pro se." Charles leaned over to Sterling, his voice carrying across the courtroom. 20 minutes. This will be over in 20 minutes. But as Evelyn stood slowly, her folder clutched in trembling hands, something in her posture suggested that Charles Whitmore had drastically underestimated the woman he'd spent 30 years taking for granted. David Sterling rose from his seat like a predator sensing wounded prey, his Armani suit immaculate under the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights. For 30 years, he'd perfected the art of character assassination disguised as legal advocacy, and today promised to be another masterpiece of systematic destruction. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd never lost, "we have before us a textbook case of marital dissolution involving significant assets accumulated through the extraordinary efforts of one party." He gestured toward Charles with theatrical reverence. Charles Whitmore embodies the American dream, a self-made entrepreneur who built a $50 million empire from nothing more than determination and genius. The gallery murmured appreciatively. These were Charles's people, venture capitalists and tech executives who understood the mythology of Silicon Valley success, where individual brilliance supposedly conquered all obstacles through pure force of will. Sterling continued his opening assault with surgical precision. Mrs. Whitmore, while undoubtedly a supportive spouse, has never held employment outside the home, has never contributed financially to the business enterprise, and has never demonstrated the business acumen required to manage significant assets. His tone suggested he was performing an act of mercy rather than legal advocacy. We request minimal alimony of $2,000 monthly, sufficient for comfortable living while protecting assets that rightfully belong to their creator. Charles nodded approvingly, his confidence radiating across the courtroom. This was exactly the narrative he'd constructed over 3 decades, the myth of singular achievement that erased all inconvenient collaborators from history. Judge Harrison's weathered face remained impassive as Sterling presented his evidence incorporation documents listing only Charles as founder, tax returns showing business income under his name exclusively, testimonials from employees and business partners attesting to his visionary leadership. Each piece of evidence built a wall around the fortune Charles claimed as his birthright. When Sterling finally sat down, the courtroom fell silent except for the gentle hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of San Francisco traffic. All eyes turned to Evelyn, who stood slowly, her manila folder seeming pathetically inadequate against Sterling's briefcase full of professionally prepared documents. "Your Honor," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "I'd like to present evidence regarding the true foundation of Whitmore Digital Solutions." She opened her folder with deliberate care, extracting a stack of yellowed papers that looked ancient compared to Sterling's laser-printed exhibits. "This is the original business plan for what became Charles's company, written in 1994 during his third failed startup attempt." The pages she held up bore her careful handwriting, every letter formed with the precision of someone who understood that ideas needed proper documentation to survive. "I called it Digital Bridge, a platform for connecting small businesses to emerging internet technologies." Charles's confident smile faltered as whispered conversations erupted throughout the gallery. Sterling shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. We have no proof of authenticity for these alleged documents." "Overruled," Judge Harrison said, her interest clearly piqued. "Mrs. Whitmore may proceed." Evelyn approached the bench, her movement deliberate despite her condition. "Your Honor, this business plan includes detailed technical specifications, market analysis, and financial projections for the exact services Whitmore Digital Solutions provides today. Every page bears my signature and Charles's approval." She handed copies to both the judge and Sterling, whose face had gone pale as he scanned the documents. Charles leaned forward, whispering urgently to his attorney, but Sterling could only shake his head in apparent disbelief. "Furthermore," Evelyn continued, "I have correspondence with our first 3 investors, all addressed to both Charles and Evelyn Whitmore as co-founders of the enterprise." She produced a manila envelope containing letters on venture capital letterhead, each one acknowledging her intellectual property contributions and partnership status. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted palpably. What had begun as David Sterling's routine demolition was becoming something else entirely, an archaeological excavation of buried truth. Charles finally found his voice. "Your Honor, that was collaborative work. I don't recall the specific details, but—" "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Harrison interrupted sharply. "You'll have your opportunity to respond. Please continue." "Mrs. Whitmore." Evelyn nodded gratefully. "Your Honor, I have audio recordings from early business meetings where Charles explicitly acknowledged my contributions to the company's development." She produced an old cassette recorder, its plastic case worn smooth by handling. The courtroom held its collective breath as Evelyn pressed play. Charles's younger voice emerged from the small speaker, tinny but unmistakably clear. None of this would exist without Evelyn's vision. She sees connections where the rest of us see obstacles. The digital bridge concept is revolutionary precisely because it came from someone who understands both technology and human needs. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles's face had gone ashen, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning fog under harsh sunlight. Even Sterling appeared stunned, his legal strategies crumbling before evidence he'd never anticipated. "I have 30 years of financial records," Evelyn continued, her voice gaining strength with each revelation. "Documentation of every expense, every business meal, every investment decision made for this company. But more importantly, I have evidence of my own financial contributions during the critical startup years." She produced a ledger book, its pages filled with meticulous entries in her handwriting. From 1994 to 1999, while Charles developed his business concepts, I worked 3 jobs: night cleaning at downtown offices, weekend catering for Silicon Valley events, and freelance bookkeeping for local businesses. Every dollar I earned went directly into funding prototypes, patent applications, and business development costs. The gallery erupted in shocked murmurs. These titans of industry, who prided themselves on understanding every angle of entrepreneurial success, were witnessing the revelation of hidden history, the invisible labor that made their colleagues' empire possible. Sterling finally recovered enough to mount a counterattack. "Your Honor, even if Mrs. Whitmore provided some early support, the subsequent growth of the company resulted entirely from my client's business leadership and strategic vision." But Evelyn wasn't finished. "Your Honor, I have one more piece of evidence that I believe speaks to the heart of this matter." She reached into her folder again, extracting a single sheet of paper that looked different from the others, newer, yet somehow more significant. "This is a letter Charles wrote to me during my pregnancy in 1997, 3 years after founding the company." Her voice carried new weight, the kind that comes from approaching dangerous truth. In it, he acknowledges that our business partnership extends far beyond legal documents or financial contributions. She read aloud, her voice clear despite the emotion underlying each word. "Evelyn, you are the heart of everything we've built. Your ideas gave birth to this company, your sacrifice nurtured it through infancy, and your unwavering belief sustains it still. Without you, I would be nothing more than another failed entrepreneur with grandiose dreams and no substance. Our child will inherit not just wealth, but the legacy of what 2 people can accomplish when one supports the other's greatness without seeking credit." The courtroom fell completely silent. Charles sat frozen, his face a mask of recognition and growing horror. Sterling's objections died in his throat as he realized his case had just imploded before a room full of witnesses. Judge Harrison leaned forward, her expression grave. "Mr. Whitmore, did you write this letter?" Charles opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. Your Honor, I was young. I was emotional. That doesn't constitute a legal contract." "Perhaps not," Judge Harrison replied, "but it certainly constitutes evidence of your state of mind regarding your wife's contributions to your joint enterprise." She turned back to Evelyn. "You mentioned a pregnancy. Mrs. Whitmore, may I ask what became of that child?" Evelyn's composure finally cracked, just slightly. "We lost our son at 7 months, Your Honor. We never spoke of him again." The revelation of their lost child hung in the courtroom air like incense at a funeral mass, transforming the legal proceeding into something sacred and terrible. Judge Harrison's weathered hands folded carefully before her, the weight of 30 years of buried grief now exposed under fluorescent lights and legal scrutiny. Sterling attempted to regain control, his voice cutting through the silence with professional ruthlessness. "Your Honor, while we sympathize with any personal tragedy the parties may have endured, we must focus on the legal facts. Emotional appeals cannot override corporate law and property rights." But the damage was already spreading like cracks in a foundation. Charles sat rigid at the plaintiff's table, his designer suit suddenly looking like armor that no longer fit. The gallery, filled with his business associates and social peers, watched their titan of industry reduced to a man who had abandoned his grieving wife to chase younger flesh and public validation. Evelyn produced another document from her manila folder, this one bearing the official seal of the California Secretary of State. Your Honor, I have here the original incorporation documents for Whitmore Digital Solutions, filed in March 1995. They list both Charles Whitmore and Evelyn G. Whitmore as founding partners, with equal ownership stakes. Sterling launched from his chair. Objection. Those documents were clearly amended years ago. My client is listed as sole proprietor in all current filings. Indeed, Evelyn replied calmly, producing a second set of papers. These amendments were filed in 2003, 8 years after incorporation. I never consented to relinquishing my ownership stake, nor was I properly notified of these changes as required by California corporate law. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations. Judge Harrison's gavel restored order, but the legal implications were already spreading through the gallery like wildfire. If Evelyn's claims proved accurate, Charles's entire empire had been built on fraudulent documentation. Furthermore, Evelyn continued, her voice growing stronger with each revelation, I have evidence of current business operations that directly utilize intellectual property I developed. She approached the bench with a thick folder. These are client contracts for Whitmore Digital Solutions' flagship service small business integration platforms. Every technical specification, every operational protocol, every customer service framework traces back to the digital bridge concept I created in 1994. Charles could no longer remain silent. That's impossible. The technology has evolved completely since then. The current platform is built on my foundational architecture. Evelyn interrupted, her quiet voice somehow carrying more authority than his bluster. Your Honor, I spent the past 3 months reviewing every patent application, every software upgrade, every system modification Charles's company has implemented. They're all variations on my original design. She produced printouts of code, technical diagrams, and system flowcharts. I may not have worked in the corporate office, but I never stopped working on the business. Every evening, while Charles attended networking events and industry conferences, I refined algorithms, debugged software, and developed solutions to problems the paid programmers couldn't solve. Sterling was frantically whispering with his client, their confident demeanor dissolving into panic. The case they'd expected to finish in 20 minutes was becoming a referendum on the entire foundation of Charles's success story. Judge Harrison examined the technical documents with surprising comprehension. Mrs. Whitmore, are you saying you've been actively contributing to the company's technical development throughout your marriage? Yes, Your Honor. Charles would bring me problems usually late at night. After his development team had reached dead ends, he'd present them as intellectual puzzles, asking for my perspective. I thought we were partners working together. I never realized he was taking my solutions back to the office and claiming them as his own insights. The gallery's murmur grew louder. These technology leaders understood the implications if Evelyn's contributions were as extensive as she claimed. Charles's reputation as a visionary was built on systematic theft of her intellectual property. Evelyn reached into her folder one final time, extracting what looked like a composition notebook, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. Your Honor, this is my innovation journal, maintained continuously since our marriage. Every entry is dated. Many are witnessed by third parties. It documents 30 years of problem solving, technical breakthroughs, and strategic insights, all attributed to Charles in public forums. She opened the notebook randomly, reading in her clear, steady voice. June 15th, 2018. Charles struggling with client retention algorithms. Suggested modification to user interface that prioritizes relationship building over transaction efficiency. Sketched prototype below. She held up a page showing detailed technical drawings and mathematical formulas. This modification became the foundation for Whitmore Digital's relationship-first platform, launched 6 months later to great industry acclaim. Charles slammed his hand on the table. She's twisting everything. Those were collaborative discussions between spouses. You never claimed credit for my work. Evelyn's voice carried 30 years of suppressed fury. Charles, you gave the keynote speech at the National Technology Conference last year, describing the relationship-first innovation as your personal breakthrough. You told 3,000 industry leaders that inspiration struck you during a solitary walk on the beach. The courtroom fell silent again. Everyone present understood the devastating implications. Charles Whitmore, Silicon Valley legend, had been plagiarizing his wife's ideas and presenting them as his own genius. Sterling made one last desperate attempt to salvage his case. Your Honor, even if Mrs. Whitmore provided some informal consultation, the legal structure of their marriage clearly established separate property rights. My client's business success cannot be retroactively attributed to casual domestic conversations. Judge Harrison's expression had grown increasingly stern throughout the proceedings. Mr. Sterling, nothing about Mrs. Whitmore's presentation suggests casual domestic conversations. But she's documenting systematic intellectual property theft spanning 3 decades. But Evelyn wasn't finished. Her next words would shatter whatever remained of Charles's public persona and legal position. Your Honor, there's one more thing. Charles's current success is built on a government contract worth $40 million, a contract our company obtained using security clearance credentials that remain in my name. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Sterling's practiced composure cracked as the full implications became clear. I maintain top-secret clearance from my college internship with the Department of Defense, Evelyn explained. Charles never qualified for security clearance due to his father's bankruptcy and associated financial irregularities. When Whitmore Digital Solutions bid on the federal integration project, they used my credentials without my knowledge or consent. Charles's face had gone completely white. The federal contract was the cornerstone of his empire's current valuation, the achievement that had elevated him from regional success to national prominence. If that contract was built on fraudulent credential usage. Judge Harrison leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. Mrs. Whitmore, are you suggesting that your husband's company obtained federal contracts under false pretenses? I'm suggesting, Your Honor, that without my contributions, intellectual, financial, and legal, there would be no Whitmore Digital Solutions. Charles didn't build an empire. We built it together. He just erased my name from the story. The courtroom felt like a mausoleum where justice had come to die. Charles Whitmore, Silicon Valley legend and self-proclaimed visionary, sat crumbling at the plaintiff's table while his carefully constructed mythology disintegrated under the weight of documented truth. But cornered animals often prove most dangerous, and Charles possessed 30 years of practice in destroying inconvenient realities. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. Your Honor, I cannot sit here and watch my life's work be stolen by someone who... His voice cracked, then hardened into something cruel and familiar. Someone who couldn't even give me a family. The words hit Evelyn like physical blows. Judge Harrison's gavel slammed down immediately. Mr. Whitmore, you will control yourself or face contempt charges. Benji. But Charles had passed beyond legal consequences into the realm of wounded pride and desperate fury. She's manipulating this court with sob stories about our lost child, but she's leaving out crucial details. The doctor said the stress of her mental instability contributed to the pregnancy complications. Sterling grabbed his client's arm, whispering urgently, but Charles shook him off with violent determination. She had what they call prenatal depression. Your Honor, irrational fears, mood swings, complete breakdowns over imaginary problems. I worked 18-hour days building our future while she sat in dark rooms talking to a baby that... Charles, stop! Evelyn's voice was barely audible, but it carried the authority of absolute pain. For the first time since the proceedings began, her composure cracked completely. Tears she'd held back for decades finally spilled down her cheeks. That's right, Charles continued, his voice growing louder as he sensed weakness. Show them the instability. Evelyn, tell the court about the nights you wouldn't eat, wouldn't sleep, wouldn't let me touch you because you were convinced something terrible would happen to the baby. Tell them how your paranoia nearly destroyed my ability to focus on saving our business. The gallery watched in horrified fascination as a man publicly eviscerated his wife of 30 years. Ashley Thompson, Charles's fiancée, looked physically ill, her face pale with the recognition of what kind of man she'd agreed to marry. Judge Harrison's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. "Mr. Whitmore, if you continue this line of discussion, I will hold you in contempt and remove you from these proceedings." But Charles was beyond rational thought, consumed by 30 years of suppressed resentment that had finally found an outlet. "She wants half my assets for what? For being a burden I carried for 3 decades, for being too weak to handle the loss that I handled while building an empire. She talks about partnerships, but what kind of partner becomes a liability the moment life gets difficult?" Sterling finally managed to force his client back into his chair, but the damage was spreading through the courtroom like poison gas. These industry titans, these pillars of Silicon Valley society, were witnessing their colleague reveal himself as a monster who blamed his wife for their shared tragedy. Evelyn sat in stunned silence, her hands shaking uncontrollably as Charles's words reopened wounds that had never properly healed. The baby they'd lost, Samuel, the name they'd chosen together during happier months, had been their last hope for genuine connection. His death had created a silence between them that filled with resentment over the years. "Mrs. Whitmore," Judge Harrison said gently, "do you need a recess?" Evelyn looked up, her eyes red but her voice steady. "No, Your Honor. I think the court has heard enough to understand what kind of man Charles Whitmore truly is." But Charles wasn't finished destroying himself. As if sensing that his public reputation was already beyond salvation, he decided to complete the demolition with brutal efficiency. "And now she's dying," he announced to the shocked courtroom. "She has Parkinson's disease, Your Honor. Progressive neurological deterioration. She'll need constant care within 2 years." The gallery gasped audibly. Even among Silicon Valley's ruthless elite, there were limits to acceptable cruelty, and Charles had just obliterated them all. "That's why I filed for divorce," Charles continued, his voice now carrying the tone of a man who believed he was being reasonable. "I'm 58 years old. I deserve a chance at happiness before I become a caregiver to someone who's already given up on living. Ashley represents hope, youth, possibility. Evelyn represents obligation to a past that brought me nothing but pain." Ashley Thompson stood abruptly from the gallery and walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking like a countdown timer on Charles's remaining human connections. The tech executives who had come to support their colleague began shifting uncomfortably, many checking their phones or studying the floor tiles with sudden fascination. Sterling made one final desperate attempt to salvage his case. "Your Honor, my client is clearly under extreme emotional stress. Perhaps we could—" "Your client," Judge Harrison interrupted, her voice carrying decades of judicial authority, "has just demonstrated why this court must carefully examine his fitness to manage significant assets, particularly those that may rightfully belong to his wife." Evelyn finally found her voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I hid my diagnosis to protect his political ambitions, Your Honor. Charles was being considered for the President's Technology Advisory Council. I knew that having a sick wife might damage his chances." The confession hung in the air like an indictment of everything Charles claimed to represent. While he painted her as a burden, she had been protecting his interests even as her own body betrayed her. "How long have you known about your wife's condition, Mr. Whitmore?" Judge Harrison asked, her tone suggesting she already suspected the answer. Charles's silence stretched until it became an admission of guilt. Finally, he spoke in a voice drained of all fight. 5 years. She's had symptoms for 5 years. The courthouse erupted in shocked murmurs. Charles Whitmore had known about his wife's progressive disease for half a decade and had used that knowledge to plan his escape rather than prepare for her care. 5 years during which you planned this divorce, Judge Harrison observed. 5 years during which you developed a relationship with Ms. Thompson. 5 years during which you systematically removed your wife's name from business documents and intellectual property claims. Evelyn looked at the man she had loved for 30 years, the man who had once written beautiful letters about their partnership, the man who had held her hand through pregnancy complications and whispered promises about growing old together. That man was gone, replaced by someone she no longer recognized. "I thought our love was strong enough to survive anything," she said, her voice carrying across the silent courtroom. I was wrong, but Charles was wrong too. He thought his cruelty was strong enough to erase 30 years of partnership. We'll see which one of us understood strength correctly. The Santa Clara County Courthouse had never witnessed a transformation quite like the one occurring outside its marble walls. Word of Charles Whitmore's courtroom confession had spread through Silicon Valley's interconnected networks faster than a viral video. And by the second day of proceedings, something unprecedented was happening. The forgotten were remembering their voices. Maria Santos arrived first, clutching a worn photograph of the Whitmore Digital Solutions holiday party from 1999. She had been Charles's first customer service representative, hired when the company operated from a converted garage and Evelyn answered phones between coding sessions. Behind Maria came dozens of other early employees, programmers, administrative assistants, maintenance staff, people whose names Charles had forgotten, but whose labor had built his empire. Mrs. Whitmore always remembered our birthdays, Maria told the gathering crowd of local news reporters. She knew my daughter's name, asked about my mother's surgery, brought homemade soup when my husband was laid off. Mr. Whitmore. He called me the receptionist for 3 years, even after I was promoted to department head. Dr. Sarah Chen stepped forward, her neurologist credentials lending medical authority to the growing movement. I've been treating Mrs. Whitmore's Parkinson's disease for 8 months. She specifically requested that her husband not be informed of her prognosis because she feared it would damage his career prospects. Even facing progressive neurological decline, her primary concern was protecting the man who was secretly planning to abandon her. The courthouse steps transformed into an impromptu tribunal where 30 years of suppressed testimony finally found voice. Harold Martinez, Whitmore Digital's former head of development, produced printouts of email exchanges with Evelyn from 2015. We were stuck on a major client integration problem. Mr. Whitmore was out of town, so I reached out to Mrs. Whitmore for advice. She solved it in 2 hours, a problem our entire team had been struggling with for weeks. When Mr. Whitmore returned, he presented the solution as his own breakthrough to the board of directors. Inside the courthouse, Charles watched through tall windows as his carefully constructed public image disintegrated in real time. The employees gathering outside weren't angry protesters. They were witnesses to a truth he'd spent decades erasing. Their quiet dignity made their testimony more devastating than any legal brief Sterling could have prepared. Judge Harrison reconvened the proceedings with unusual gravity. Mr. Whitmore, before we continue with your defense, I'm compelled to inform you that this court has received numerous requests from individuals seeking to provide testimony relevant to this case. Would you like to address these developments? Charles's remaining composure finally shattered completely. They're vultures, Your Honor, disgruntled employees looking for their 15 minutes of fame. Evelyn has obviously coordinated some kind of media campaign to... I haven't spoken to any of those people. Evelyn interrupted softly. I didn't even know they were coming. But Charles was beyond rational response, his paranoia and desperation combining into toxic fury. Of course you did. This whole performance is calculated manipulation. The trembling hands, the sad stories, the convenient evidence you've somehow preserved for 30 years. You're trying to steal what I built with my blood, my sacrifice, my... He stopped mid-sentence as the courtroom doors opened and a figure from his past entered with quiet dignity. Thomas Whitmore, Charles's elderly father, walked slowly down the center aisle, his presence immediately commanding attention. At 82, he retained the weathered strength of a man who had survived poverty, loss, and his son's systematic rejection of his working-class origins. "Hello, son," Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent watching his boy become someone he didn't recognize. "I came to speak for Evelyn, since you seem to have forgotten how." Charles went pale. He hadn't spoken to his father in 5 years, not since Thomas had refused to sign a non-disclosure agreement about Charles's difficult childhood during a documentary filming. "Dad, you don't understand what's happening here." "I understand perfectly," Thomas replied, taking a seat in the gallery beside Maria Santos and Harold Martinez. I understand that the woman who sent me birthday cards for 30 years, who paid for my heart surgery when you said the company couldn't afford such personal expenses, who called every Sunday to check on my health, that woman is fighting for her life while my son calls her a burden. The courtroom fell silent as Thomas's words settled like dust after an explosion. Judge Harrison gestured for him to continue. Your Honor, I worked 3 jobs my whole life to give my son opportunities I never had. When his mother died, I could have remarried, could have chosen an easier path, but I sacrificed everything for his future. Thomas's voice grew stronger. Evelyn made the same choice. She gave up her dreams, her education, her identity, to build something beautiful with the man she loved. And now he wants to throw her away, like yesterday's newspaper, because she's no longer convenient. Charles attempted one final counterattack, his voice rising to a shout. She's dying anyway. What's the point of destroying my future for someone who won't be here to enjoy the settlement? The words echoed through the courthouse like a gunshot. Even Sterling covered his face with his hands, recognizing that his client had just provided the most damning testimony possible. The gallery erupted in shocked gasps and angry murmurs. But Thomas Whitmore wasn't finished. Son, your mother died when you were 12. I watched you become hard, watched you decide that loving people meant giving them power to hurt you. But Evelyn never hurt you. She loved you through every failure, every cruel word. Every year you grew further from the good man she married. And now you're going to lose everything, not because of her claims, but because you've shown this court who you really are. Evelyn rose slowly from her chair, her manila folder forgotten as she faced the man who had been her partner, her betrayer, her greatest love and deepest disappointment. Charles, I'm not fighting you for money. I'm fighting for acknowledgement that our life together mattered, that the woman you married, the woman who built your empire alongside you, deserves to be remembered as more than an inconvenience you discarded. She turned to Judge Harrison, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. Your Honor, I have one final piece of evidence, not a document or a recording, but a truth that explains everything. She reached into her purse and extracted a small velvet box that looked decades old. This was my mother's engagement ring, given to her by my father in 1952. When Charles's second startup failed in 1995, I sold it to a pawn shop to fund the prototype that became Whitmore Digital Solutions. I never told him because I didn't want him to feel guilty. She opened the box to reveal it was empty. I've spent 30 years believing that love meant sacrifice without recognition. I was wrong. Love without acknowledgement isn't love, it's servitude. The courtroom had become a cathedral of absolute silence. Every person present understanding they were witnessing something sacred and terrible, the death of a marriage and the birth of justice. Charles received everything he ever wanted, Evelyn continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Success, wealth, admiration. A young woman who sees him as a hero instead of a man. I only want one thing in return, the truth. I want this court to acknowledge that Whitmore Digital Solutions was built by 2 people, not one. That my 30 years of love, labor, and sacrifice weren't charity dispensed to a grateful dependent, but partnership systematically erased by a man who found gratitude inconvenient. She sat down slowly, her legal case complete. Outside, the gathering of employees and supporters had grown to over 100 people, their quiet vigil transforming the courthouse into something resembling a memorial for all the overlooked contributions that build great fortunes. Charles sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that his war against Evelyn had become a war against himself, and he was losing both. Judge Margaret Harrison had presided over 3 decades of divorce cases, witnessing the systematic destruction of marriages with the detached professionalism that legal training demanded. But as she reviewed her notes from the Whitmore proceedings, she understood that this case transcended typical marital dissolution. What lay before her was a reckoning with Silicon Valley's foundational mythology, the myth of individual genius that erased collaborative achievement. The courtroom felt different as proceedings resumed for final arguments and judgment. Outside, The gathering of Whitmore Digital Solutions employees had grown into something resembling a peaceful vigil, their presence transforming the courthouse steps into a memorial for forgotten contributions. Local news crews documented the unprecedented scene of workers supporting their founder's estranged wife against the man who'd made them wealthy. Before rendering judgment, Judge Harrison announced, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority earned through decades of careful consideration. This court wishes to address the broader implications of the evidence presented. What we have witnessed is not merely a dispute over asset distribution, but a systematic examination of how partnerships, particularly those involving women, can be erased from historical record through legal manipulation and social convention. Charles sat rigid at the plaintiff's table, his earlier fury replaced by the hollow expression of a man watching his world collapse in real time. Sterling had abandoned any pretense of legal strategy, recognizing that his client's courtroom behavior had transformed their case from civil proceeding into public character assassination. Mrs. Whitmore, Judge Harrison continued, this court finds your documentation of intellectual property contributions, financial investments, and business development activities to be credible, comprehensive, and legally significant. The evidence clearly establishes that Whitmore Digital Solutions was founded as a partnership, regardless of subsequent alterations to corporate documents. Evelyn remained motionless in her chair, her hands folded carefully to minimize the tremor that betrayed her declining health. She had entered this courtroom seeking acknowledgement, not vengeance, and the judge's words carried the validation she'd spent 30 years waiting to hear. Furthermore, Judge Harrison said, her gaze settling on Charles with unmistakable disapproval, this court is deeply troubled by evidence of systematic intellectual property appropriation spanning multiple decades. Mr. Whitmore's conduct suggests a pattern of taking credit for his wife's innovations while simultaneously diminishing her contributions in public and private forums. The gallery remained silent except for the soft sound of Thomas Whitmore weeping quietly in the front row. At 82, Charles's father understood he was witnessing the final destruction of his son's moral character, a process that had taken decades to complete, but only days to fully reveal. Judge Harrison consulted her notes before continuing. Regarding asset distribution, this court awards Mrs. Whitmore 60% of all marital property, including business interests, real estate holdings, and investment portfolios. This percentage reflects her documented contributions to the enterprise's intellectual foundation, operational development, and financial stability during critical growth periods. Charles finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a croak. Your Honor, that percentage would effectively give her control of my company. Your company, Mr. Whitmore. Judge Harrison's tone carried decades of judicial skepticism. The evidence suggests it was always our company, despite your successful efforts to erase that partnership from public record. This court is simply restoring legal recognition to relationships that existed before they were systematically obscured. But the judge wasn't finished with her comprehensive judgment. Additionally, this court orders the establishment of a medical care fund to ensure Mrs. Whitmore receives optimal treatment for her Parkinson's disease, funded through Mr. Whitmore's assets at a level commensurate with the standard of living she helped create. Evelyn closed her eyes as the financial implications settled around the courtroom. 60% of a $50 million empire meant security for her remaining years, but more importantly, it meant acknowledgement that her life's work had value beyond domestic servitude. However, Judge Harrison continued, this court recognizes that monetary compensation cannot address the deeper issues raised by these proceedings. Mr. Whitmore, your treatment of your wife during these hearings has been unconscionable. You have attempted to weaponize her medical condition, blame her for shared tragedy, and diminish 3 decades of partnership into dependency. The judge's words carried moral authority that transcended legal judgment. This court strongly recommends that you seek counseling to address whatever psychological factors have led you to systematically devalue the person who made your success possible. Charles sat in stunned silence as the full magnitude of his loss became clear. He would retain 40% of the company he'd claimed as his singular creation. But more devastating was the public revelation of who he really was beneath his carefully crafted persona. Then something unexpected happened. Charles rose slowly from his chair, his movement carrying none of his earlier arrogance or fury. When he spoke, his voice had changed completely, the bluster replaced by something that might have been recognition. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "may I address the court?" Judge Harrison nodded cautiously, clearly prepared to shut down any further outbursts. "I want to apologize," Charles continued, his words carrying across the silent courtroom. "Not to satisfy legal requirements or minimize financial consequences, but because I need to say what should have been said 30 years ago." He turned to face Evelyn directly. "You were right. About everything. I built my reputation on your ideas, your sacrifice, your unwavering belief in possibilities I couldn't see myself." Evelyn looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time since the proceedings began. "I became so afraid of acknowledging my dependence on you that I convinced myself you were dependent on me," Charles continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I told myself that taking credit for your work was protecting you from the pressures of public success. But I was really protecting myself from having to share the spotlight with someone whose genius made my own contributions look ordinary." The courtroom remained absolutely still as Charles continued his confession. "When you got sick, I saw it as confirmation that loving people meant accepting burdens I didn't want to carry. I forgot that you had already been carrying my burdens for 30 years without complaint." He paused, looking around the courtroom filled with former employees who had witnessed his transformation from struggling entrepreneur to Silicon Valley icon. "I don't deserve forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. But I want everyone in this room to know that Evelyn Whitmore is the most brilliant, generous, and strong person I've ever known. If she had been born male, she would have been the CEO, and I would have been grateful for the opportunity to work for her." Judge Harrison watched this unexpected development with careful attention. "Mr. Whitmore, are you requesting to modify your position regarding asset distribution?" "No, Your Honor," Charles replied. "I'm asking for the opportunity to care for my wife during her illness, if she'll permit it, not as a husband with legal rights, but as someone seeking to earn a small measure of redemption for 30 years of taking her love for granted." The silence that followed felt sacred, as if the courtroom had become a confessional where souls were weighed against lifetimes of accumulated choices. Evelyn stood slowly, her manila folder forgotten as she faced the man who had been her partner, her betrayer, and now perhaps something else entirely. "Charles," she said softly, "I stopped needing your care years ago, but I never stopped wanting your partnership." She turned to Judge Harrison. "Your Honor, I accept the court's judgment regarding asset distribution, but I would like to request that the Medical Care Fund be expanded into a foundation supporting research into neurodegenerative diseases and assistance for families facing similar challenges." "Furthermore," Evelyn continued, her voice growing stronger, "I propose that Charles and I work together to ensure Whitmore Digital Solutions becomes the kind of company we originally envisioned, one that recognizes all contributions and supports employees through personal crises, rather than abandoning them when they become inconvenient." Judge Harrison smiled for the first time since proceedings began. "Mrs. Whitmore, your proposal suggests that wisdom and grace can emerge from even the most difficult circumstances. This court approves the establishment of the Whitmore Foundation and encourages both parties to consider how they might transform this painful experience into something beneficial for others facing similar challenges." As the gavel fell, marking the official end of proceedings, something unprecedented occurred. The gallery erupted not in celebration or anger, but in sustained applause that seemed to acknowledge both the end of one story and the beginning of another. Outside the courthouse, the gathering of employees and supporters had grown into a celebration of recognition, acknowledgement that great achievements result from collaborative effort, even when history records only singular names. Charles and Evelyn walked out together, not as a reconciled couple, but as partners who had finally learned to see each other clearly. The man who had spent decades taking credit for shared achievements was beginning the long journey toward understanding what true partnership meant. while the woman who had given everything without recognition was finally free to claim her place in the story they had written together. The Whitmore case became a watershed moment that rippled far beyond Silicon Valley's insular circles. Their story illuminated a fundamental truth about success. Every achievement stands on a foundation built by multiple hands, even when history records only one name. Evelyn's courage to speak her truth transformed not just her own life, but the lives of countless overlooked partners whose contributions had been systematically erased. The Whitmore Foundation, established with 60% of the family's assets, became a beacon for families facing medical crises and a research powerhouse for neurodegenerative diseases. More importantly, it embodied the principle that true partnership means sharing both credit and responsibility, especially during life's most difficult chapters. Charles's journey toward redemption proved that even the most hardened hearts can crack open when confronted with undeniable truth. His public acknowledgement of Evelyn's contributions sparked industry-wide conversations about hidden collaborators, the spouses, partners, and employees whose invisible labor makes visible success possible. Their story reminds us that gratitude isn't just a sentiment, it's a moral obligation to acknowledge those who sacrifice for our dreams. Family, whether biological or chosen, is built through consistent recognition of each other's worth, especially when that recognition comes without expectation of reward. Have you ever witnessed someone's contributions being overlooked or stolen, like what happened to Evelyn for 30 years? What would you have done in her situation?